Hello, Year 13. This lecture is looking at crime prevention and control, particularly social control. Just to get started, I'd like you to have a think about what impact can living in a bad neighbourhood have on a child's life chances. And you've got an example there in the yellow box about a study by Sharkey, who examined the impact of violent crime on students' standardised tests in the following week. So what I'd like you to do is just read through that study and have a think about what impact is living in that type of neighbourhood having on that child's life chances. And at the bottom I've said, what would this keep on recreating, do you think? So when you live in a bad neighbourhood, there are a few things that can make up a bad neighbourhood. So the schools in the area might not be doing so well in league tables. The local health service might not be adequate, or the GPs might be oversubscribed, or the NHS hospital might be too far away. There might be limited green space. The policing style might be more conflict in terms of them monitoring you instead of trying to be there to support you and look after you. And it's all more than likely that the crime level will be quite high. Now, all of these things combined can have a hugely negative effect on a child's life chances or anyone living in that area's life chances. So, when we think about crime prevention and crime control, well, there's two different ways of looking at it. The first one is, how do we prevent crimes from occurring? And the second one is, how do we deal with crimes once they do actually occur? So what, in terms of the nature of punishment? So I just want you to think about it very quietly to yourselves and annotate on your PowerPoint. What prevention measures do you personally take to avoid being the victim of a crime in some different situations? Can you think of any prevention measures that are taken in your family home? And any prevention measures you've seen elsewhere, so maybe around the school, on the school buses, or even in the shops. And I'd like you to think about how these different preventative methods go about actually stopping someone committing a crime. What do they all assume about the criminal would be a starting point. We've examined situational crime prevention before when we were looking at the right realist approach to crime and deviance. Situational crime prevention is all about reducing the opportunities for a crime to occur. And they do this through two things mainly. They increase the effort of committing the crime and reduce the rewards. This is known as target hardening. Okay, so for example, in the context of having a car, you might make sure you have a central alarm system installed, and that increases the effort. Okay. They could also make it more difficult by putting registration numbers on car radios, for example, which actually makes it much more harder to sell on the car radio, and that kind of reduces the rewards. The other thing you can do to reduce the rewards is make the punishments much more serious. The key idea is to make a situation so risky to the criminal that they do not choose to commit the crime. And again, it rests on the assumption that criminals are rational actors. So an example of, target hardening or situational crime prevention is in the UK alone, okay, we have 4.2 CCTV cameras. And it's on average, the average UK citizen appears on the CCTV camera around about 300 times a day. We now have registration plate recognition cameras on most of the busy roads in the UK. Neighbourhood watch schemes have been increasing and are becoming more popular again. And you've also got airport security measures that are being introduced or improved, and all of these are aimed at making a situation so risky to commit a crime that the person will not commit it because they're scared of being caught. So, for example, how does this airport security measure reflect rational choice theory? How does this reflect the idea that the criminals are rationally choosing to commit crime? This is what's known as a full body scan going through airport security. Now, if you knew you had to go through one of these, what might you think about carrying on board that gun? Some of the examples of environmental crime prevention, and all of these are environmental crime prevention strategies when you're trying to change the environment so therefore the crime doesn't occur. We've looked at zero tolerance policing, like 3 strikes and you're out, which was based on Wilson and Kelling's broken windows theory. And there's a very quick reminder of that theory. How is it that graffiti and broken windows seems to tell us there's an absence of both formal and informal social control? They argued that informal social control can be improved through an environmental improvement strategy, which is like when you deal with these problems of mending windows and picking up litter and cleaning graffiti, this shows people that people care about this neighbourhood, so they're less likely to commit a crime. And that's informal social control. Whereas the formal social control can be improved through zero tolerance policing, so tackling small indecencies of disorder in order to prevent more serious crime occurring, so things like loitering. It is, however, worth AO2ing the broken windows and zero tolerance approach with the example of what happened in New York City. And we looked at that in lesson. Now, can you remember any of the weaknesses or the problems of zero tolerance policing in New York, some of the evaluation points you have on your Right Realist notes, or you can have a look at page 138 in your textbooks in order to find them. At this point, I'd like you to read the article Opportunity Makes the Thief, which I've given you in class. I would like you to examine what this article is suggesting about crime. And can you think of any practical policies you could develop in response to some of the assertions about crime in the article? And what are the patterns in crime from this article? What sort of patterns are they seeing? I'd then like you to Google search independent, unhappy, Mondays and phone in order to find this article that I think criticises the argument that all crime is opportunistic. It's a very interesting article about the fact that Mondays is the most common day to have your mobile phone nicked, which to me would suggest that actually crime isn't random and opportunistic. There is something about Mondays that's leading to people stealing more phones. So can you have a look at that article and we'll discuss it in class. So 2 articles to read. Another criticism of situational crime prevention is the idea of CCTV and whether it actually helps to fight crime. This is an article that I'd like you to read now called Surveillance Society. Now, what are the key criticisms of CCTV in that article? Can you pick out an example? What types of crime does CCTV have more of an impact on? And what types of crime does it have less of an impact on? How is it useful for crime detection? And actually, according to this article, who is actually most frequently under surveillance? I'd now like you to have a read of the King's Cross article, because this is the one that's very interesting for the main criticism of situational crime prevention or any environmental crime prevention strategy, which is the theory of displacement. So please have a read of the King's Cross article, and in front of you is a map of the King's Cross area. And I'm sure many of you know this, but about just under 10 years ago, it was proposed that the Eurotunnel be linked straight through to King's Cross. So as a result, a huge redevelopment project started to take place in the King's Cross area, and they tried to clean up the neighbourhood. It used to be infamous as a red light district, drug use, prostitution, and what have you. Now, when they started to develop the area, close down the nightclubs, get rid of some of the more seedy bars, what was it that started to happen to all that criminal behaviour? Like, did it completely stop? Or, as I'm sure you've guessed, was it displaced elsewhere? And in the article, you should be able to identify where much of that criminal activity is being displaced to. Which leads me on to the next slide. about the five main criticisms of situational crime prevention, or SCP. It's the idea that it doesn't reduce crime, they just displace it in one of the following ways. The first one is spatial. People move elsewhere to commit crime. Then temporal. They commit a crime at a different time of day or month or year. Target. They choose a different victim. Tactical. They choose a different method to complete the same crime. Or functional. They decide to commit a different type of crime, that should say, sorry. Now what I'd like you to do is think about which of those 5 criticisms can be applied to that King's Cross article you've just read. Just to extend the criticism of situational crime prevention, which again, if you look in your textbooks at page 137, it tends to focus on street crime and very much ignores white-collar crime. It also assumes all criminals are rational actors, and what about those who are on drugs or are drunk, which we know is a very key cause, particularly of street crime and violence. And it also ignores the root causes of crime or structural causes of crime, such as poverty. So when we examine different styles of policing, there are 2 different types, and we've touched on these before. The first one is the consensual approach, where close relationships between the local area and the police exist. And the police will represent the interests of the majority of the community. The police officers themselves will come from that community and reflect its interests. And individuals are caught as a result of complaints from the community. Now, what theoretical perspective would favour this approach to policing when it comes to crime and deviance? The conflict approach is something we've been talking quite a lot about in class, actually, and one of the main people who wrote about the conflict style of policing is Grayson in 1985. This is the idea that the police force, or the policing in this country, actually imposes middle-class values on working-class and ethnic minority communities. And they use things like the threat of violence in order to keep them in order. Now, this links to the different types of power: ideological control or coercive control. When ideological control fails and people start to realise that things are unfair, start to protest, this is when, arguably, the ruling class will use the powers of force or coercion, such as the police force. And this is very much demonstrated by the police behaviour during the miners' strike in 1984, of which you've got a picture there on the right, and we have, if you want to Google that, you can find out a bit more about the police tactics in 1984. Grayson argued that in working class and ethnic minority areas, you'll have higher patrol rates. Okay, now that feeds into official statistics, and we know why, but can you annotate that in your PowerPoint? They also highlighted that the laws that are imposed reflect ruling class interests. Okay, so for example, they're way more likely to protect property over personal safety. And generally, in a conflict approach to policing, crime is prevented through coercion and not working with the community. So as a result, crime is much more likely to go underground. I've given you a little extract there. It says, in working class areas, the police are more likely to use a conflict style of policing using more surveillance and stop and search tactics. This generally antagonises the local community, creating them and us relationship. Can you remember who argued that? And with those who feel they've been treated unfairly, losing respect for the law. Okay, so if you lose respect for formal social control, what happens? Well, you've got the LA riots following the killing of Rodney King. You've got the protests in Ferguson that are bordering on riots because of the shooting that occurred there. You've even got the London riots as well, you might want to talk about as well, as a reaction against this conflict style of policing. Here are some stop and search statistics per 1,000 of the population. Okay, and the graph in front of you has taken into account, okay, the fact that the black community is a much smaller proportion of the population than, for example, the white and Asian community. However, what you can see is that the number of stop and searches per 1,000, around about 100 of them were from the black community in sort of 2001. And this highlights the fact that they are being stopped and searched and targeted much more often. On the right-hand side, you've got an opinion poll of such, talking about asking, do you think the police discriminate on the grounds of race? And overwhelmingly, the opinion is yes, they do discriminate on the basis of race. The consensus approach to policing would very much favour the social and community crime prevention strategies that are sort of discussed below. They focus much more on the social context of crime and ways of reducing the need for crime taking place in the first place, and attempt to tackle the causes of crime. This is certainly something that Marxists would be interested in, especially if it's going to deal with problems like relative deprivation. There's a quote there from Tony Blair. Sorry, it's gone a bit funny. It says, the government's going to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. So this is a very clear example of the left realist approach, because remember, left realists and right realists agree that crime is a real problem that needs to be dealt with, so they're going to be tough on crime. However, left realists focus very much on what causes individuals to start committing crime, relative deprivation, subcultures, and marginalisation. Okay? Like Merton, they argue that rising crime is partly the result of increased expectations of high standards of living, combined with restricted opportunities to achieve it. And remember, Lee and Young highlighted the role of the media in fueling a sense of relative deprivation. This is all very well and good, but how can you prevent relative deprivation in a capitalist society? Is it a realistic notion that the media can stop fueling relative deprivation? Well, not really. So what are the problems with these examples of crime prevention strategies, which, like I said, generally focus on trying to deter people from committing crime, or, as a social and community approach, try and deal with the causes of the crime? So here they are: situational crime prevention, zero tolerance, styles of policing, stop and search. Well, the main problem is that they all focus on street crime, and this affects the definition of what constitutes a crime problem, and very much ignores the crimes of the powerful. So what theoretical perspective would make this criticism of all of these different examples of crime prevention strategies? When considering crime prevention strategies, this is a really useful point to start thinking about social policy on crime and deviance. Remember, you will have a whole section in the theory part of your crime and deviance paper. A 33-mark question could come up on sociology and social policy. So talking about criminal policy is a type of social policy. So below are some examples from the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher right the way through to the New Labour government in '97 under Tony Blair. We are going to talk about this in a bit more detail, but Mrs. Thatcher wanted to restore the rule of law, and actually Conservatives in the 1970s and 80s were very firm against law breaking, and that was their stance. They tried to paint themselves as like the party that was tough on crime, and tried to portray Labour as being very soft on criminals. So she introduced things like stop and search and the short, sharp shock approach when it comes to rehabilitation. So if you assume that stop and search will work, and that short, sharp shock rehabilitation, which is when they introduce military-style training regimes in juvenile centres in order to rehabilitate young people. So what are they assuming for the short, sharp shock? What are they assuming is the cause of crime? Okay. And if you believe that stop and search is a useful tool, therefore, again, what is the cause of crime? Okay, what would stopping and searching put people off doing? In 1987, we saw a bit of a shift with enlisting the community, so using rehabilitation of offenders and alternatives to prison, and things like Neighbourhood Watch was given a bit more authority, or a bit more was revitalised. So in this case, what must be the cause of crime if you're using the community and Neighbourhood Watch programmes? 1993, a return to back to basics and prison works. So again, this is a shift again. What's the cause in crime if you believe that it's all about punishment and prison? And again, 97, shift once again. Toughen crime, toughen the causes of crime. So therefore, what are they recognising as the cause of crime? What I'd like to think about for each of these policies is what do they tell us about the changing views on what causes crime, and can you link each approach to a theoretical perspective on crime and deviance? Likewise, can you do the same on the next slide? Much more recent policies on crime, so this is from the Conservative Liberal coalition mainly. ASBOs were replaced with criminal behaviour orders. No drinking alcohol on the tube. You had 42-day detention of terror suspects, a crackdown on knife and gun crime, taking a more tolerant approach to the possession of smaller amounts of cannabis, stricter rules on tax avoidance, and this is an interesting one. We've had the marketisation of the prison and rehabilitation service, where organisations that manage to rehabilitate ex-offenders so they don't re-offend within a year are actually given some financial rewards. So, each of those policies, can you please link to a theoretical perspective on what causes crime? And what does each policy tell us about the changing views on what does cause crime? I just want to leave you with this graph on the number of ASBOs issued in England and Wales between 1999 and 2005. Please can you annotate some statistics, and we'll talk about it in class. Thank you.